in '82 and the rest of your term as co-chair, what did you personally want to accomplish for the organization?
In the very first newsletter of the International Association, which came out before the June '82 convention, I had outlined what I thought was the likely role of the co-chairs and officers in the NA, the IA, and I felt that initially our function was just to get a structure in place and to create the sense that there was a functioning organization, that there were people who could, in fact, sustain it and keep it going, that it was, and convince ourselves more than anybody else that we were viable at a minimal level. Remember, at this early stage, we were still perceiving ourselves, I think, as in competition substantially with Mike Smith and his quarterly. And we needed to sort of prove that we needed to be. And we felt that, but again, we were so strapped for resources and we were spread apart, and our process was so democratically cumbersome that it made it very, very difficult for us to do much of anything. And then, of course, there were disagreements among us. Nonetheless, I perceived my role as the black co-chair of the International Association to be primarily an advocate nationally for the causes of articulating an opposition to racism in the lesbian and gay community, and communicating and articulating opposition to homophobia in the black community. That was my perceived external charge.
You as black co-chair, or you as co-chair? Did you see that more as incumbent upon you, more so than the white co-chair? Did you see the sort of division of duties, if you will?
No, not at that time I didn't, because Henry Weemhoff was far more articulate and brilliant than I was, and the chapter from which he came was more politically sophisticated than the chapter from which I came, and I was clear about that. But I was also very comfortable with it. However, it is my observation that starting with me, and not with Henry Weemhoff as white co-chair, but Jerry Mallon, who replaced him, that a pattern began in the International Association of having black co-chairs who tended to articulate the International Association's agenda externally, and to be sort of our spokesperson, our visible representative. And the internal running of the organization, the administrative work, would increasingly largely fall upon a white co-chair. And there was certainly no agreement, explicit or implicit, that this was to be so. It was a reality that emerged out of our personalities, and out of the responsibilities that each of us felt we had and felt we could discharge.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And so it just sort of happened.
And that's also part of the working as a slate, as a team.
Well, initially it was in our case. I don't know I don't know how many of the subsequent co-chairs did run as a slate, but we set the pattern. We did set the pattern, and I'm not sure that it wouldn't have happened anyway, because as I said, I think it was personality driven. But it certainly became, for the first 4 or 5 years of the existence of the International Association, it was certainly a pattern that you saw. Mm-hmm. And I think we were pretty comfortable with it. I don't think that there was any concern or opposition about that at the time. It was never a clean division, right, but it was functional. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually, it was a benefit, an unexpected benefit of running on the slate. Mm-hmm. During our first 6 months as co-chairs, Henry and I didn't have an external presence. We were operating by memoranda internally, trying to, where's the money? Have we got any money in the bank? Let's transfer it to the editorial board and sign off and so forth. We didn't do anything externally, except the involvement that we already had in our local chapters. From June of 82 until September of 82, we didn't do anything at all. From then until the next convention, we really began to kick into high gear. And Henry, as I said, after the 82 convention in Washington, D.C. in June, never effectively was able to divert energy from his profession to the NA. And that was comfortable with me because during the period immediately prior to and months immediately following the 82 convention, and most particularly at the 82 convention, I was dysfunctional. So when Henry couldn't function, that didn't seem, it was like, okay, it's my turn. And that worked fine. The problem was that Henry was never able to come back. And around about December, there began to be agitation for him to resign. And it was sparked by Mike Smith, who had never been comfortable, who had an ongoing, much talked about feud with the New York chapter. And the result was that Mike called for Henry to resign. And when it became clear that I was doing, for several months, had been and continued to do most of the work for the organization. And Henry, immediately upon the suggestion being tendered, actually, come to think of it, I felt that it was my responsibility to communicate to Henry that I was getting a lot of recommendation and demand for his resignation. I felt that shouldn't come from somebody else. He'd become isolated both from the New York organization and from the International Association because he was working trying to save his clinic, and he just was out of communication. And so I felt that it was incumbent upon me as his friend and co-chair to call him and say, this is afoot, people would like you to resign.
Did you also share that feeling?
No, because frankly, by this time I got into the swing of running things and making decisions unilaterally. I have to make a confession here. I was never one of the great Democrats, small d.
So it was good that he was kind of milquetoast in that way.
Right. I always felt that in order to get things done, you needed one person in charge. And that while I was committed to racial parity, I was committed to it only insofar as it didn't prevent you from sustaining the viability of the organization. So Henry was far more committed to it than I was. Mm-hmm. And when he was running things, he consulted with me absolutely on every possible occasion, on occasions when I didn't think that he needed to. But at that time, I made myself pretty much available to him. And in the first 6 months, it was very collaborative. And I don't remember us ever having any serious disagreements.
So though you did not yourself feel that he should resign, you felt that he should know all the other people who were feeling he should resign, and that it should be you who told him.
Right, and I did. I called him in New York, and he immediately offered to resign. He said, he did not want to resign. I want that on the record. He didn't feel that it was necessary because he and I both felt comfortable with the arrangement, and he felt that I was doing a good job and had taken charge, and that he was going to come back, and he intended to do that fully. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't do it yet. And as soon as I suggested it to him, he wrote a letter of resignation.
And this was when, approximately?
This would have been December of
82
or January of 83.
Mm-hmm.
And then, once he told me that he was going to do that, then I began trying to figure out, well, then, what do we do? Do I continue all along that we won't have racial parity? And now we're down 2 officers because the treasurer had resigned as well. And it was just Jim Searcy, and both of us were black. And we were
also on the West Coast.
And both were on the West Coast in Southern California, not just the West Coast, we were both in Southern California. The editorial board was always an independent body. It was functioning still independently. And actually it sort of ground to a halt somewhere around in here. And so I talked to Jim. We figured out what should be done. There was nobody on board but the two of us. And so what we did is we elected Jerry Mallon of Philadelphia. Well, that's the argument. I mean, technically it required a majority vote of the members of the steering committee.
Oh, I see.
But there were only 4 of us, and Bob Rucker had resigned, so there was no treasurer, and Henry Weemoff had resigned, so there were 2 of us. So we chose Jerry, and Jim didn't really know Jerry, so he did it largely on my recommendation, trusting my judgment that this was the person I wanted to work with as co-chair. And there was some ruckus about it. Mike Smith in particular took very public exception to it and said that the process that allowed, that in our bylaws, that allowed a steering committee member to be replaced by the other steering committee members in the case of a vacancy was never meant to include the co-chairs. And he very, very vocally communicated his dissatisfaction with that, while privately assuring me, and sometimes publicly, that he was, that he thought that I was doing a fine job. He just disapproved of the process by which I was running things. And nonetheless, nobody else. Jerry was so universally respected in the International Association that there was, other than the objection to the process, nobody objected to Jerry Mallon taking the position on. And Jerry and I were very close friends. So
you and the treasurer elected Jerry to take over as the co-chair.
Me and the secretary, Jim Searcy of St.
Secretary, excuse me, from approximately that period of January 82 until the convention, January 83 until the convention of 83.
Until the July of 83.
So that's what happened, is that 3 of you served as the officers.
As the officers
until
of the
that
International
convention.
Association, until that convention, when we were again reconfirmed in office. But a number of things happened during that period. Jerry came on board, and Jerry started kind of immediately. Jerry is the kind of incredibly articulate, brilliant. He was an astronomer. He was a PhD, but he was soft-spoken and congenial, and believed in inclusiveness and consensus working. And he was an absolute genius at management and administration and crossing T's and dotting I's, which was never my strong point. And so he took over the administration. In this time, it was explicit by memorandum, by agreement of memorandum between the two of us.
Sort of the division of
we divided our responsibilities, and this was to be his, and there were certain responsibilities I was to take on. And he explicitly took over the sort of accounting functions that had fallen into total desuetude.
So, Charles, could you speak about the things during that period that you did to fulfill that duty of being external to the gay and lesbian community, to fight racism, and to the black community to fight homophobia? What are some of the things you got involved in?
Well, first of all, I also felt that I had internal responsibilities to help support chapters. So I began traveling, and we had a little bit more of a treasury now, more chapters of paid dues. And I began traveling, and I traveled to some of the cities where chapters existed, and like Dallas, where a chapter was forming, and would become the occasion of an official gathering. They could use my coming as an event and issue press releases, and I would work with them if they didn't know how to do that, sort of to build a reason to have a black and white men together meeting in their area, whether they were a fledgling chapter or whether they were a solid chapter. And so I was doing that kind of chapter support, but I was also trying to keep us out of local disputes, which cropped up all the time. But externally, I met with Ginny Apuzzo, who had just become the executive director of the National Gay Task Force in New York. And I met with Steve Indine, who had become who in addition to being executive director of the Gay Rights National Lobby, which was sort of a dying organization, was under attack at that time, and was sort of fading out, but he had become the treasurer and had founded a new organization called the Human Rights Campaign Fund, which was the shifting of the national lesbian and gay rights movement from a grassroots, in-your-face 60s style movement to checkbook activism. And the Gay Rights National Lobby represented the old style of in-your-face kind of politics, which was sort of going out of style now in the early 80s, had gone out of style, and were no longer effective, had achieved probably pretty close to what it could. Although there was significant disagreement within the International Association on that score. But Steve Indine was transitioning and had created the Human Rights Campaign Fund, which was not so much a membership organization as it was a donors place, an organization to which you sent donations, and it then donated money to candidates and to causes. Mm-hmm. And it was the new face of lesbian and gay activism in America. And I had a number of conversations with Steve about that and felt that we needed to be there as that transition took place. And so I met with him. I actually worked very closely with him during that year, but my request for a member of Black and White Men Together to be recommended for membership on the board of the Human Rights Campaign Fund, he stalled on it. We had major arguments and disagreements over that while remaining close friends until he died some years later. But he resisted that because he felt that it was incompatible, that in a way Black and White Men Together, of which he was a member, represented the old style identity politics way of fighting for issues and causes and fighting for the lesbian and gay rights agenda. And that our agenda, therefore, would not be the exclusively legislative, campaign, politically focused, money-driven kind of agenda that was shaping up for the Human Rights Campaign Fund, and which is probably still, to a significant degree, its agenda, and its way of promoting its agenda. And so he resisted that. I never got anywhere with him. With Jenny Apuzzo, I got further. Jenny Apuzzo and I agreed that when she spoke, and at that time she was considered the most dynamic spokesperson in the lesbian and gay community nationally. She drew the most headlines. She headed an organization which was seen as still vital while the National Gay Rights Lobby had sort of faded, and GRNL, the Gay Rights National Lobby, had faded out of the forefront and out of media coverage. And she was dynamic, and she was going places, and she was heading an organization that could transition us into the new kind of politics, the 80s politics. And she met with me willingly, and what I asked of her was, number one, there was an issue that was of significant concern to our Washington, D.C. chapter and to some of the other chapters, and that was that there was an African-American man who was the primary lobbyist for the National Gay Task Force in Washington, D.C., who had also once been nominated as vice president of the Democratic Party at a Democratic convention. Obviously he didn't win, but in the early 80s he had sort of carried our agenda. And he'd also spoken in our Washington, D.C. convention. And I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but it'll come to me. And he was definitely the best known African American gay rights activist in the 80s. And he was fired. And he was fired by Jenny Apuzzo, who, becoming executive director, became his boss. She fired him, I found out, because Steve Indine, over at the Gay Rights National Lobby and Human Rights Campaign Fund, said that he couldn't work with him, and he wanted him removed. And in a spirit of cooperation between these two national organizations, she removed and took the flak for it. And she didn't tell me that. Steve eventually confided that to me. But the point was that we sort of began to deal and operate at that level of politics that the International Association did. And I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And Ginny Apuzzo agreed that every time she spoke before any audience, that she would mention the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus provided the largest chunk of votes for gay rights bills, and particularly for the gay rights bill, a bill mandating non-discrimination against lesbians and gays in Congress, that we provided more and earlier consistent votes than women, than Jews, than any other group you could name in Congress, despite the fact that it was widely perceived in the lesbian and gay community at large that blacks tended to be homophobic. Mm-hmm. And I explicitly asked her to acknowledge that in her public speeches, and she agreed to do that, and she did. And she had her office send us clippings that showed that she agreed to do that. Mm-hmm. And she agreed to recommend that when organizations were meeting, when agendas were being formed, when meetings with legislators were being put forth, that representatives from the African American lesbian gay community be invited to participate early on. Whatever it was, anytime she was consulted about that she would say, hey, it isn't simply sufficient to contact us and to work with us. You need to also understand that there are voices out here in our community that are not being represented, and they need to be included. So she agreed to do that, and she did. We worked well together.
So it seems you had an additional task that you were working on, not only dealing with homophobia in the black community, but also dealing with the myth that homophobia is more prevalent in the black community.
Exactly. But I also did try to address it with probably less success in the black community. I tried to address homophobia. I met with Julian Dixon, who was at that time the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, to talk about the traditional, sort of flip sides, and I said that some of the strongest support that comes for civil rights comes from lesbians and gays. And I tried to draw parallels between the civil rights needs and the discrimination that was suffered by lesbians and gays to that of African Americans without equating the two. And in the early 80s, this was fairly new. And he agreed to meet with me. He refused to allow any media to be present, but he did agree to meet with me. And we had a good conversation. He agreed to communicate to other members of the Congressional Black Caucus the fact that there was indeed an emerging black gay constituency, which could both serve as a source of support within the lesbian and gay community and liaisons. I specifically asked him to work through us in dealing with the lesbian and gay community at large, which was increasingly coming to be seen as a power base and a major constituency and source of funding. And I asked him, go through us to deal with Human Rights Campaign Fund and Gay Rights National Lobby and National Task Force on Lesbian Gay Rights. And he said he would. He didn't, but he said he would. But I made the initial contact. I wrote a letter and asked to speak at the National Association of Black Psychologists. They declined to allow me to speak, but they did publish my letter, and it went out to all the members of that organization, and it was a very basic appeal to join with the mainstream of psychologists in explicitly condemning homophobia and affirming that homosexuality per se was not a psychological pathology. And again, I was not allowed to speak, but they did provide me a forum to their members. So those were some of the things that we did. I worked hard with The Advocate, which at that time was the largest gay publication in America.
It was national.
Yeah, and increasingly perceived as conservative, very much committed to, David Goodstein was the publisher at the time, and David Goodstein was very much committed to checkbook activism, and he basically felt pretty much that that was indeed an area where ethnic or identity politics type organizations such as BW&T had no real role to play and probably would not be willing to step up to the plate. And he and I had a number of discussions, and actually, as a result of that, became good friends. And he began to provide more coverage of the emerging black gay community as a political presence in his publication as a direct result of those contacts. So in that sense, I also made an appeal to and was allowed to speak at the National Association of Gay Business Councils. National Association of Gay Business Councils. And they had done some things which I felt were pretty exclusionary or insensitive at the time. And this was early on, and I probably castigated them more than I should have and more than they deserved. And I did eventually back off of that. And that put them initially into a hostile mode. But it ultimately led to communication. When they held their convention, they did invite me to come and speak to their board of directors about these issues. And we had a strenuous dialogue, but by then I had indeed gotten to the point where I felt that we were able to communicate.
Thank you, Charles. Let's take a little break here. Ready. Okay, Charles, now we're kind of getting into the 83 convention, which was held in Columbus.
Right.
And you went in there as one of the co-chairs, probably a year and a half as being co-chair.
Right.
And so tell us about the convention.
Okay, well, actually, stepping back just a brief moment, the convention of 1983 was not supposed to be held in Columbus, Ohio. It was supposed to be held in Chicago, Illinois. However, the founder of the Chicago, Illinois chapter had come to Washington, D.C. in what became sort of the tradition again, where at every convention, a chapter would step forth, or a network would step forth and say, we want to host the next convention. Well, Bob Kleinhans of Chicago came forth in Washington, D.C. and said, we want to host the next convention, the 83 convention. Apparently he hadn't cleared that altogether with the leadership in his local chapter. Mm-hmm. And they didn't want to take on the responsibility. It was an enormous responsibility. It caused a lot of disruption in the Washington, D.C. chapter, despite the fact that it became a tour de force and Mayor Marion Barry had shown up in Washington, D.C. and what have you. Nonetheless, the Chicago chapter said, we don't want to do this. And Bob had no authority to do it. And that problem occasionally did crop up. However, they backed out, and we had no convention. And by this time, I think it was probably around November or so of '82, we were sort of stuck. And we had to have a convention because that's where our business got transacted, and it was becoming our tradition. And so I thumbed through the newsletters of the various chapters, and I concluded that the chapter which seemed most dynamic at the time was the Columbus, Ohio chapter.
Is that right?
And it was important because Columbus was also in the Midwest, and there had been a considerable amount of rumbling that leadership of the International Association had heretofore come from the coasts. And it was very important, therefore, that we pay attention to
Middle America,
so to speak, especially because also at the Washington, D.C. convention, a bid had been made with a very impressive presentation for conduct of the 84 convention in Atlanta, Georgia. And they had indeed been approved by the board to host the 84 Atlantic convention. So we knew we were going to the South. We had done it in either coast, Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. The Midwest was the logical choice, and it seemed to me at the time that the Columbus chapter was exceptionally dynamic, though a relatively small chapter. And so I turned to the leader of that group and asked if they were interested in or willing to take this on. And the leader of the group, who shall remain nameless at the moment at least, did what Bob Kleindienst did in Chicago and said yes, rather precipitously. And I said, well, maybe you better go and consult with your chapter, because this is turning out to be a bit of a problem. I don't know how he arranged it, but they, in fact, did agree to host it, and they rose to the occasion. It later became obvious that they had sort of been corralled into it, but they really did rise to the occasion. And it was the first time one of our smaller chapters, a chapter which had fewer than 50 members, took on the convention. Yeah. But they did a great job.
In the space of like 7 or 8 months?
And yes, with relatively little operating funds that we were able to transmit to them. And in the space of only 7 or 8 months, remembering that the Atlanta chapter, which was one of our larger chapters, had said, we'll bid for it, but only if we get to do it a year hence. And 2 years hence, actually. So in 82, they bid for the 84 convention and came with a slide presentation and everything and won us over. But they weren't prepared to do it in 83. So the folks of Columbus really stepped into the breach and did a yeoman's job. And it came out very, very successfully, as it turned out. And it sort of addressed some of the problems that we had of no visibility in the Midwest. And it allowed a lot of people to attend the convention for the first time who had never attended either coastal convention. So that was an important achievement. Right. At the same time, the board had sort of come into its own in Columbus, and there was a lot more feeling that on the one hand, we had a solid structure, but there was a lot more criticism of how money was spent and how things were proceeding and what our priorities needed to be and so forth. Mike Smith still played a very prominent role as a delegate from San Francisco at that convention. Nonetheless, I think that people were generally pleased with the stewardship of Jerry Mallon and myself. They re-elected us for another term. Things went relatively
One more year?
For one more year. And things went smoothly, actually. There was a lot of complaint and rumbling and recommendations and suggestions, but they were all within the context that the International Association is real. It exists. It's viable. It's got forward momentum. It was no longer a question of can we do this? Should we have done this? Can this be made to work? It was more, how can we make it serve our needs and meet our agendas now that we've got a national organization? And in that sense, I think Jerry and I sort of came away with a sense of, we helped give birth to this baby, and we were proud of the job that we did, frankly. And that sort of ended an era. That was the beginning. That was the birthing process of the International Association. And I think it was a pretty successful process in the sense that it established some traditions, created some structure, set some agenda. Jerry Mallon really got the books in order and created a process which was, really responsive and responsible and open, and he demanded some accountability in terms of the accounting of the National Association, which Colin Gibson, when he became treasurer of the National Association, would eventually sort of raise into an even more open and professional type of accounting to our membership. But that was sort of the birthing of the International Association. I want to go back just briefly, if I may, to something that happened very important in Washington, D.C. in 1982. And that was the birth of one of our finest traditions. I hope it's an ongoing tradition in the International Association. It is. And that is the tradition of the black and white caucuses. Billy Jones had spoken at the first convention in San Francisco. And at the second convention in Washington, D.C., where he and his lover were living at the time, he came and I think he volunteered to create the idea for the schema for, and to run a black caucus for the very first time at one of our conventions, while simultaneously a white caucus was run. And it turned out to be an incredible experience, at least for me. Obviously, I was in the black caucus, and it turned out to be an incredible opportunity. And the first opportunity we had taken, certainly at the national level, and as I recall, it was replicated to a very large degree when people went back to their chapters, this notion of having a black caucus. It was controversial, and there were those, and there are those, who think that it should never have happened, that it violates the fundamental principles of the National Association of Black and White Men Together. Nonetheless, we did it.
And what do you say
in response to that?
In response to that?
That the experiences of blacks and whites in this country are not merely profoundly different, but to a very large degree contradictory and antagonistic. We are races who have been taught to thrive at the expense of one another to a certain degree. And there has been exploitation and so much negative history that it is idealistic, it is a goal to be sought and pursued, but it is premature to expect that we can utterly divest ourselves of the baggage that we bring from the society outside into our interactions with one another and into our participation in black and white men together. Mm-hmm. And so what we felt would be helpful would be the creation of safe space, an opportunity, and also to create a sense of responsibility for members of the white caucus to dialogue with one another, and for black men within the context of the black caucus and elsewhere, we hoped, to dialogue with one another. There have always been some accusations that the white men and black and white men together ignore the white men. There have always been accusations that the black men in BWT ignore the black men, at least when interacting with the other race. And to a certain extent, the caucuses were created to counter that charge, to create a counter energy going in the other direction, to affirm brotherhood and connection. And for black men who have been taught, in particular since the Black Power movement in the 60s, that we do in fact have a responsibility to consider one another brothers and to help one another, it was to relieve a certain sense of guilt and to create a certain kind of to restart a dialogue that maybe had become muted. And among white men, many of the white men at the time said, we don't know that we have anything to say to one another. We don't know what we would say to one another. And Billy Jones says, then let's find out. And so the black and white caucuses were created.
And what we are talking about is perhaps 1, maybe 2 hours of meetings in a 4 or 5 day convention. Is that correct?
Exactly. No more than that. Nonetheless, the very first one became controversial when, in the Black Caucus, we had an incredibly moving communication going on, facilitated by Billy. And as black men and women, too, are wont to do in such circumstances where there is that kind of sense of safe space and an opportunity to be candid with one another, we began to testify. And in the process of testifying, we ran a bit over time-wise. Well, as I recall, the guy running the White Caucus, it might have been Mike Smith, but it may have been somebody else, I don't recall. It might have been someone from the New York chapter. Their caucus time ended on time. and they adjourned, And they sort of were waiting for us to adjourn to come back together and debrief and share what was appropriate to share away.
So there was also at the time a meeting of both groups after the separate group.
Right, yes, we were to come together afterwards, and that was kind of insisted upon by those who weren't altogether comfortable
So
with
from
the
the
idea of
beginning,
separation.
I
Yes.
see.
And so we had an appointed time at which we were to adjourn our respective caucuses and to come back together, which was both symbolic and to satisfy one another's curiosity to the degree that we felt appropriate about what was to go on in either of these caucuses. And ours went on. We just got into it, and ours went on, apparently considerably over time. And I guess members of the White Caucus got tired of it, and after a couple of times of peeking in and trying to see whether we were coming to an end, I think Mike Smith and somebody else came in and said, you know, it's really time for you guys to adjourn and get back together with us. Well, what did they want to do that for? I mean, you talk about testifying before them. Billy Jones had to practically bar the doors to prevent a riot on the spot. I mean, it created enormous anger and an instant bonding. We thought we had bonded before, but we really bonded at that moment, and created a bit of a crisis. And when we did get back together, the members of the White Caucus, I think, were substantially blown away by the amount of anger that they experienced as a result, and they felt some envy about the degree of closeness, the fact that we felt that we had so much to share, and some of them were very candid about that feeling. Most of them were very candid about feeling all of
And
those
perhaps a little
emotions.
bit paranoid about it, or uncomfortable
Yes,
with it.
there was, yes.
That it was closeness with each other,
Right.
which therefore meant being away from them.
That was talked about, spoken about. It was some of us accused some of the white members of that, and some of the white members copped to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of the white members, again, I think led by Mike Smith, said, you know, but we feel like we're being guilt tripped here. We had agreed upon a specific time when we were to do these things, and it's not fair, it's not appropriate that we were left waiting, and it's not fair and it's not appropriate that we should be made to feel guilty about it. So I mean, there was a real dialogue there.
So did that become the biggest issue of the
convention? Yes, yes.
Oh, not only of the meeting afterwards.
Oh no! That colored the whole convention. Oh,
that the Black Caucus went overtime.
By far and away, that was the issue that people will remember most from the BWT DC convention, was the fact that for the first time we had these separate caucuses, and they created an enormous explosion and an enormous bonding among the blacks. And those two factors, that there was an explosion and that there was profound bonding, would become a tradition of the Black caucuses for the next several years.
To this day, I think.
Really?
Yes.
I'm not surprised.
Yes. Well, do you want to talk about the Convention 85 and your involvement with Convention 85? Or there's also the issue of the